Welcome to Casual Friday. So first I'm going to update you on what I've been doing in my knitting life for the past week, tell you a little bit about a sweater project I'm working on and how I'm making modifications from working it flat to working it in the round. And then I want to talk about some knitting terms that I used last week in last week's video that I just sort of mentioned and somebody asked about because they hadn't heard one of the terms before, and the other term they had heard used in a different way. So there's lots of ambiguity in knitting terms, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about those terms, what I understand them to mean, what other people sometimes understand them to mean, and why there can be some ambiguity. So let's get started. Oh, and always, if you want to jump from one point to another, there are links down in the description. So the September meeting is one that I always look forward to, and a lot of other guild members look forward to, because it's the meeting where anyone who has entered a knitted item in the fair can bring it to the guild, and they can present in front of everyone. They can show what they entered. They can read the comments from the judge's card. You tell us how many points they got, whether they got a ribbon or not, and then everybody can see what they had. They used to do this thing where they would then put everything on the back table so you could go up and look at them again later up close. Now they're doing it where they're photographing everything, and I think to put on the website or in the Ravelry group or something so that you could see the items. And I was a little disappointed that I couldn't actually look at things up close, because there's always this trend in the judges' comments that there would be some kind of comment about some aspect, some technique, something that seems to come up over and over again in the comments. Years ago, it would be buttons. Like there would anytime there was somebody put buttons on their project, whether it was just a decorative button on a hat or it was buttons for a cardigan, the judges would make some comment about them, like they didn't seem suitable, or they really were beautiful or something. It seemed like there was a lot of focus on the buttons and it became kind of a joke. This year, I don't think anybody's comments had anything to do with buttons, but the comment that kept coming over and over again was about the underarms. And like, oh, the underarm could have been neater, or your Kitchener at the underarm could have been tidier, which was puzzling to the woman who got that one because she didn't use Kitchener stitch. She picked up stitches along a cable cast-on edge. But it was interesting that that was a comment that came up over and over. And it came up so often that one woman was up there holding her sweater and started to read the comments, and someone yelled out, "What did they say about your underarms?" And so I was curious to take a look at the sweaters and see if I could see what the judges were seeing. Some of the people, sometimes when you get a critique like that, the people will say, "I totally agree with them. I know this is my weakness." Or, "Yeah, they have a point." And sometimes people are like, "Well, I don't know what they're talking about. I can't see what they're saying." It would be interesting to me to be able to look at these sweater underarms and see if there was something that in particular the judges were pointing out that could be finished better. In part just because I'm curious about that and to see if I would agree with that. And also, well, maybe that could be a video. I mean, I've done a video in the past about underarms and thumb gussets, the holes that you can get there in different ways that you can make sure that those are a little neater and tidier. So I was just curious about what they were seeing and if I would have seen it too. But because they're photographing things now after they've been shown to the group, the people were just gathering them up and taking them, and they weren't available on the back tables like they used to be. So that was too bad. But while I was sitting, I always get there early because parking can be a problem because this is a pretty popular meeting. So I was sitting there knitting, and there's a woman 2 rows in front of me who turned around and said, "Oh, I really liked your video on the state fair." So we were talking a little bit about the fair, and I asked her if she had entered anything, and she said yes. And we were talking about the challenges it can be to, find your items. And And then I asked her, well, did you win any ribbons? And she said yes, and she had gotten 2 first place ribbons for socks that she entered. So she pulled them out and showed it to me. They were just beautiful. She won a first place. Her name's Kelly, by the way. She won a first place ribbon for colorwork socks. So she did these toe-up stranded colorwork socks, and she said she didn't usually do toe-up socks, but she really wanted to do these particular socks. And so she used my Judy's Magic Cast-On video to get her going on the toe up. And then she did a pair of socks using that won first place in the textured category. And she did Bavarian Traveling Twisted Stitches, which tend to be, if they're well done, will almost always beat any other textured stitch pattern. And you could have something that's elaborate cables, Bavarian Traveling Twisted Stitch patterns are going to beat them every time, assuming the knitting quality is the same for both. So that was really fun to see. Oh, I wanted to mention that sometimes when I'm talking about a previous video, like an old Technique Tuesday video, sometimes I'll mention that I'm putting a link at the top. Sometimes I don't mention that at all. I just think of it later when I'm editing the video, that, oh, I should put a link in there. And I just want to let people know what's going on there. If you click on that link, you're not going away from the video. What that does, there's like a little eye, looks like an information button up there, and it's there the entire video. So you might see something that says, you might be interested in such and such a video. And you can click on that later. And so like toward the end of the video, you could click on that, and any video that I've linked to at some point in the current video, there'll be a list of those videos that you could then go and check out later. Just wanted to let you know what that was. So I started a new knitting project this week. I had ordered yarn for it 3 weeks ago. It finally came in on Wednesday. I'm almost done with the first ball of yarn. It's probably going to take me 5 balls of yarn. Using Cascade 220, the Superwash Merino, which I'd never used before. Knitting this for my daughter, who has sensitive skin, and the sweater I'm knitting has kind of a high neck, and I wanted to make sure that it was going to be soft enough for her. So I knit this sweater once before, earlier this summer, for my younger daughter. It's a pattern from Vogue Knitting. It's like 2002. So the original sweater was quite a bit shorter than I knit it for my younger daughter. She wanted to be able to tuck it into her pants, her jeans, if she wanted to. So I added 5 inches to the body for her. My older daughter came home from California, saw the sweater, really liked it, wanted it in a different color. She wanted it in the original length. And so that's what I'm doing for her. Now, when I knit the sweater the first time, it's designed to be knit in pieces, flat, and then seamed. I don't mind seaming. I don't love it. It's not my favorite thing, but I don't mind it, and I'm good at it. So if a project calls for it, then I'm happy to do it that way. I did think that there was I wasn't sure how I wanted to knit the sleeves the first time. If I was going to knit the sleeves flat and then seam them in, which I really like the look of a seamed set-in sleeve, prefer that look. I prefer the process of picking up stitches, doing short row shaping, and knitting the sleeve down. I prefer that process, but I wasn't sure which I was going to do. If I was going to seam the sleeve in, I wanted to make sure that the body was knit flat and was laid flat while I was doing that seaming of the sleeve cap. It's just much easier for me to do that than if I have to try to seam it into a closed hole. So because the picked up version short rows knit down worked just fine, then I decided for the second sweater I'm going to knit the body in the round. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about things to keep in mind when you are converting something, knitting flat versus knitting in the round. The first thing you have to think about is the pattern, the stitch pattern, and how to change that. Because when you're knitting flat, you're knitting across, let's say you have 100 stitches. You're going to knit across the right side row from stitch 1 to stitch 100, and then you're going to work on the wrong side row from stitch 100 to stitch 1. So you're knitting in reverse. So stitch 1 gets knit at the very beginning and then the very end of a 2-row process. And whatever you knit on the wrong side row is going to be purled on a right side row. And, if you're doing decreases, you have to keep that in mind, those kinds of things. So sometimes it's pretty straightforward. If you're doing stockinette, it's no problem. But if you're doing a stitch pattern, sometimes you have to really think through, how am I going to convert this to knitting in the round? The other reason I don't mind knitting flat and seaming, especially the body, which isn't that big a deal to seam straight seams, is because of the psychology of knitting a smaller piece for me. So for the same reason I don't like knitting socks 2 at a time, I do not enjoy knitting a sweater in the round because it feels like it's going so slowly. If I'm knitting on half as many stitches, I can get twice as far, and I feel like I'm making more progress. And I know that it's psychological. I know why I feel this way, but it's just something I prefer. But when I knit this sweater flat, one of the aspects of the stitch pattern is that on the right side rows, it's a garter rib. So there's 2 columns of knits and then alternating with 2 columns of garter stitch. That means on right side rows, I was doing a knit 2, purl 2, like you would for any rib. But on wrong side rows, I was purling the entire row. So 3/4 of the stitches were being purled. And again, I don't mind purling, but when I knit the sleeves in the round, top down, I had the opposite situation where I had 3/4 of the time I was doing a knit stitch, and I preferred that. I decided that it would be worth it to me to go ahead and knit this in the round, and then I can have every other round just be a plain knit instead of having to do purling all the way across. The other thing, though, that I have to take into account is how the stitch pattern is affected by losing the seams. So I have some friends who, when they switch from working flat to in the round, they don't bother to reduce the number of stitches at the sides. They just keep the original stitch count, and then they knit the body all the way up. That way, when they're binding off from the armhole stitches, they can still bind off the same number that they would have anyway. And depending on the kind of stitch gauge you are working with, the kind of thickness of yarn you're working on, 4 stitches, 2 stitches at each side, may not make a huge difference in the circumference of the finished sweater. You might even be able to block it, somehow, so that and your gauge itself may not be so exact that the resulting sweater is really going to be changed by trying to compensate for the 4 seam stitches that you no longer need. It also depends on what the stitch pattern you're using is. So if you're working in stockinette, maybe you don't need to change your stitch counts if you're converting from knitting flat to knitting in the round. But because I'm working in this ribbing pattern, I did need to take that into account. So the ribbing pattern, like I said, was a knit 2, garter 2 all the way across, and each of the original flat pieces was supposed to start and end with a knit 2. So when I was seaming the front to the back, I would have 2 knits here on one piece and 2 knits here on that piece, which is 4 knits. But then when I seam, I lose the 2 knits at the edge, and then I have 2 knit stitches remaining, and the stitch pattern just remains continuous all the way across the seam line. So I really couldn't maintain the original stitch count if I wanted my stitch pattern continuity to stay the same. Now the thing is, it's a 4-stitch repeat, so technically I would still have a 4-stitch repeat, and I could just do knit 2, garter 2 all the way around, and it would work out just fine, except that there is a pattern that goes up the center of the sweater that needs to be symmetrical. And if I just had worked knit 2, purl 2, garter, or knit 2, garter 2 all the way around, those ribs would not be exactly the same on the front as they were on the back, and it would really mess up the stitch patterning that way. So I eliminated 4 stitches, two stitches at one side and two at the other, And so it reduced my total cast on number by 4 stitches, which also means that when I get to my underarms, instead of doing a bind off 5 for each half of the underarm for each piece, which is a total of 10 stitches, I'm only going to bind off 8 stitches at the underarm all the way across because I've lost those 2 seam stitches. And then one more thing that I have to change for the sleeves is because I'm also doing those in the round is to lose 2 stitches off of each sleeve because I'm eliminating the seam there as well. So I just thought I'd talk about that in case it's something that it's a fairly easy change to make, assuming that you understand how to work your stitch pattern from the right side rather than the wrong side. So assuming you understand that, it's fairly easy to convert something from flat to in the round. But again, there are reasons why you may choose not to do that. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some ambiguous terms in knitting. There's so many of them. Knitting is filled with ambiguity because of regional differences and I think miscommunication sometimes, or misunderstanding from one knitter to the other, or just because the terms used are flat out ambiguous and not terribly specifically descriptive of something. So last week, well, let me just show you a clip of what I said last week that prompted the comment. There are blended decreases and full fashion decreases. And blended decreases where, like, if you have a swatch like this and it's getting narrower, you're working decreases, so it's getting narrower. That blended decreases would be decreases that lean in that same direction as the edge was leaning, where full fashion would be decreases that leaned toward the edge. Here's what I was talking about. Here's a swatch where I used what are called blended decreases. So the decreases are leaning toward the area changing in size. So they're leaning in the same direction that the edge itself is leaning. So when you place it a couple of stitches in, the whole span of stitches from the decrease to the edge are all moving together as one. So the Knitting Guild Association within the Master Hand Knitting program calls those blended decreases. Then there is the situation where you can do the opposite, where you can lean your decreases toward the edge, or another way of saying that is leaning them away from the area changing in size. And the Master Hand Knitting program calls these full fashioned decreases. So the comment I got was someone commented they had never heard that term blended decreases, and that when they were a new knitter around 15 years ago, they had heard the term full fashioned as describing just the placement of decreases several stitches in from the edge, and not that it had anything to do with the direction that they were leaning, which I thought was kind of an interesting distinction. I had never heard that term. But I really don't hear knitters talking about blended and full fashion decreases ever. They often talk about you need to mirror them and you can choose which direction you want to lean them. That's your choice. A lot of times it's an aesthetic choice. Sometimes it's a practical choice. If you're working with texture or color patterns, the direction that you lean the decreases can make a difference in maintaining the stitch pattern continuity. But I was curious about this. I mean, in my mind, that 13 years ago when I first saw blended full fashion, that locked it into my head. And so I don't know if the Knitting Guild Association created those terms as part of the Master Hand Knitting program as a way of sort of standardizing how we talk to each other, at least within the program, and possibly so that it will bleed out to the rest of the world. I don't know. But I do know that I didn't see those terms in any of the technique books I had at the time. So I decided to look up some of the technique books I've bought since that time. I looked in Principles of Knitting, which a new edition came out several years ago. And I didn't see her speaking about these phrases in there. Which didn't surprise me. She tends to come up with her own terms anyway, so that didn't surprise me. Then I looked in the new edition of Vogue Knitting. Vogue Knitting, Ultimate Knitting Book, they came out with a new edition, I think in like February, earlier this year. And I looked in there and they had really updated the section on increases and decreases. Now it's much better. And they do mention now full fashioned decreases. And in the Vogue Knitting, they say that it's when you are placing them several stitches in from the edge. So the same term is used in a similar way, but not exactly the same way. And so I was thinking about why would they be used. There's like this subtle difference. Vogue Knitting is using full fashion to describe simply the placement of decreases away from the edge, where the Master Hand Knitting program talks about the direction that the decreases are leaning. But there's another knitting term that's very close to full fashioned, and that's fully fashioned. Fully fashioned is a term used in commercial knitwear, so things that are machine knitted. There are two basic processes for creating a machine knitted garment that has shaping in it. One method is to use knitted fabric and then cut out pattern pieces like you would for woven fabric. This would allow you to use bolts and bolts of knitted fabric that was the same width, and you could just cut it out to whatever sizes you wanted, and then you would sew it together. So that's called cut and sew. The other method is called fully fashioned, and that is using decreases and increases to shape the fabric. Now that fabric shaping is not done at the edges, it's done several stitches in from the edges. And it often creates sort of a decorative look. And overwhelmingly, I was looking at every single piece of machine knit garments I could find in our house, and I couldn't find a single example of blended decreases where you could see that line of decreases. Every sweater that I found, my husband's and mine, has at the underarms, decreases are placed several stitches from the edge, and they always point at the edge. In addition, though, they typically are double decreases, and they aren't double decreases the way we would do them in hand knitting typically, where we would take 3 stitches and then work them together in some way so that we ended up with 1 stitch. That's not how they do it in machine knitting typically, at least from all the examples I was looking at. Instead, what they do is it's like a combination of doing a 4-stitch cable where 2 stitches are crossing 2 stitches. It's sort of like that, except that you're joining the stitches together. So if you have 4 stitches, you put 2 on a cable needle and you cross them like that so that one needle is behind the other, and then you work 2 stitches together as a knit 2 together, 1 stitch from each of the needles and 1 stitch from each of the needles again. Then you have created 4 stitches that have been reduced to 2 stitches in a really decorative manner. So I haven't seen any sleeves that had decreases pointing away from the edge, none at all. I think that often a combination of cut and sew and fully fashioned techniques are combined in sweaters, because what I've noticed around the necks is you don't see the signs of the decreases at all. You can see that the neck is shaped differently, and I don't know if they're doing cut and sewing. I don't know if they're doing some kind of short row type of thing, or I don't know what's going on at those necks and at the sleeves. One of the commercial sweaters I looked at, the seams were a little bit wider for the sleeves, which seemed to indicate to me that there maybe was some cut and sewing going on. I don't know specifically. If anybody out there knows exactly what's going on when you can't see the decreases on the fabric in a machine knit thing, if it's likely that they're combining techniques. So my thought process has always been that the Master Hand Knitting program chose the term full fashioned decreases pointing at the edge, that they chose that term because fully fashioned commercial knitwear uses decreases that point in that direction. Whereas this other interpretation seems to be that fully fashioned garments place decreases away from the edge, and therefore full fashioned decreases just implies placing, where you're placing them. My argument would be that you're supposed to place your decreases in from the edge. You are not supposed to place them at the edge. That there is a lot of confusion by hand knitters about instructions like decrease at each end of next row. That gets interpreted as knit two together in the edges of the next row. They're not saying knit two together. They're saying decrease. And they're not saying edges. They're saying at the ends of the row. And so the implication is that you choose which decreases you're going to use and where you're going to place them. And so you can choose whether, where you're going to lean in one way or the other. So in my mind, these two uses that are very similar for the term full fashioned both point back to commercial knitwear that uses the term fully fashioned to describe shaping the fabric rather than using cut and sew. In hand knitting, those aren't our choices. Our choices aren't, are we going to cut and sew, or are we going to use decreases and increases to shape? We are going to use decreases and increases to shape. And the choice is, where are we placing those? Are we placing them in the edges, or are we placing them away from the edges? There are situations in which a pattern will specify that you are to work the first two stitches together in some manner, or work the last two stitches together in some manner. But the interpretation of the instruction decrease at each end of next row is not knit two together at each edge. There are a lot of ambiguous knitting terms. I did a video last summer on the difference between pick up stitches, pick up and knit stitches, and knitting up stitches, and what the confusion can be, and how sometimes one of those terms can apply to two different techniques, and two of the different terms can apply to one technique. This isn't an isolated incident, this full-fashioned confusion. If there are any ambiguous terms that you would like clarification on, you can leave those down in the comments or over in my Ravelry group, Rocks. If you enjoy my videos and you'd like to say thank you by buying me a coffee, you can do that at ko-fi.com. There's a link down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.